In mid-June 2026, President Trump stood before cameras and declared something remarkable. The United States and Iran, he said, had reached a deal that was fully complete. Iran, in his words, had sort of agreed to the terms. It sounded like victory. A war that had dragged through the Middle East for months was, according to the man who started it, over. For a moment, the narrative was simple. America had forced Iran to the table, dictated the terms, and walked away with everything it wanted. A ceasefire, a nuclear freeze, opened shipping lanes through one of the most contested waterways on Earth. Washington had won. But narratives are not the same as reality. Fast forward 1 month. It is now July 2026, and the picture looks nothing like victory. Strikes have resumed across the region. American and Iranian forces have exchanged, intensifying fire, threatening to unravel the very ceasefire Trump called fully complete. Mediators are scrambling behind closed doors, trying to pull both sides back from a war that was supposed to already be finished. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which a fifth of the world's oil moves every single day, remains a live flashpoint, its future still unresolved. So here is the question this documentary will answer. If America truly held all the leverage in this deal, why is it fighting so hard to keep it alive? Why would a superpower, one that claims to be doing Iran a favor by signing this agreement, find itself back at the negotiating table within weeks, absorbing strikes, sending mediators, and quietly hoping Tehran doesn't walk away first? Something doesn't add up, and the answer isn't in the headlines. It's buried in the fine print of the agreement itself, in clauses about oil, about frozen assets, about a $300 billion reconstruction fund that nobody in Washington wants to talk about on camera. What most people miss is that this deal was never really about Iran's nuclear program at all. That was the story America told the world. The real story is about something Washington needs far more urgently than it's willing to admit. To understand what's actually inside this agreement and why it collapsed so quickly after being called complete, we need to go back to the moment it was signed and look closely at what both sides actually put on paper. On June 17, 2026, in Geneva, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian remotely signed a document that both governments described as historic, a 14-point Memorandum of Understanding designed to end months of open war. On paper, it read like a comprehensive roadmap to peace. In practice, it was something far more fragile, a framework built on a 60-day clock with almost every difficult question deferred rather than resolved. The core provisions were significant. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes, was to reopen for unrestricted shipping. No tolls, no harassment of vessels, no naval blockade. In exchange, the United States agreed to release approximately $25 billion in frozen Iranian assets and lift sanctions tied to oil exports. Perhaps most striking was the commitment to a $300 billion reconstruction program, a sum that signaled something beyond a simple ceasefire. It looked like an investment in Iran's continued stability, not its collapse. On the nuclear question, the language was carefully hedged. Iran agreed not to pursue or acquire nuclear weapons, and both sides agreed to address Tehran's existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium. But the document essentially froze the nuclear question at the pre-war status quo, leaving the actual enrichment limits to be negotiated within that 60-day window. In other words, the hardest issue in the entire conflict wasn't solved. It was postponed. And postponement, it turned out, was the deal's greatest weakness. Within days, analysts were already warning that Iran approached the agreement as though it may never survive the 60-day window. That skepticism proved justified almost immediately. By early July, strikes had resumed across the region, with American and Iranian forces exchanging intensifying fire that threatened to unravel the ceasefire entirely. Iran issued warnings about mounting an all-out defense if strikes continued, while both sides traded accusations that the other had breached the spirit of the MOU. Meanwhile, delegations gathered in Doha for what should have been the next stage stage of negotiations, refining the details of Hormuz access asset transfers and the reconstruction fund. Instead, the talks revisited issues that were supposedly already settled in Geneva just weeks earlier. Points that both sides had signed off on in June were suddenly back on the table in July with no clear explanation for why. But here's the deeper issue. This was supposed to be settled 2 weeks earlier. A deal announced as fully complete was in practice unraveling in real time, and neither side seemed willing to say so publicly. To understand why an agreement this carefully negotiated could collapse so quickly, we have to go back further than June 2026. We have to look at the long history of every previous attempt to constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Because this isn't the first time a deal like this has been signed with confidence only to fall apart under its own weight. The real story begins not in June 2026, but in every failed attempt before it. To understand why this MOU is so fragile, we have to go back over a decade to July 2015, when Iran and the P5+1 nations, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in Vienna. The JCPOA was at the time the most ambitious non-proliferation agreement of its era. It imposed strict limits on Iran's uranium enrichment, subjected its facilities to intrusive international inspections, and in exchange lifted crippling economic sanctions. For a few years, it worked roughly as designed. Then on May 8, 2018, President Trump withdrew the United States from the deal entirely, calling it the worst deal ever. His stated rationale wasn't just about enrichment levels. He argued the JCPOA had ignored two critical dangers: Iran's ballistic missile program and its expanding influence across the region through proxy militias in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. He promised better terms would follow. They didn't materialize during his first term at all. That withdrawal didn't just end a deal, it poisoned the well of trust for everything that came after. By 2022, Iran had dismantled the international monitoring mechanisms the JCPOA relied on and began enriching uranium to near weapons-grade levels, closing the door on simply reviving the old agreement. Fast forward to 2025. A new round of negotiations began in Oman in April, led by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. 5 rounds of talks unfolded across Rome and Muscat, but in June 2025, that diplomatic track was violently interrupted. Israel launched what became known as the 12-day war, striking Iranian military and nuclear sites directly. Diplomacy gave way to open conflict. Talks resumed in early 2026, but the underlying disputes hadn't changed. Iran refused to negotiate its ballistic missile program, calling it non-negotiable. The U.S. insisted any deal had to address missiles' regional proxies and a complete halt to uranium enrichment even at civilian levels. Analysts at the time warned that both nations' red lines made failure just as likely as success. Those warnings proved accurate. By February 28, 2026, joint U.S.-Israeli strikes hit Iran, directly killing senior regime officials in the opening hours of what became a sustained war. What followed was months of fighting, punctuated by brief ceasefires that never held, cycling through the same pattern again and again. Talks stall, tensions spike, strikes resume, and a new round of negotiations begins under even greater pressure than before. Look closely at this pattern and a clear picture emerges. Every deal since 2015, the JCPOA, the 2025 Oman talks, the 2026 Geneva rounds, has functioned less as a resolution and more as a pressure relief valve. Each agreement bought time rather than solving the fundamental distrust between Washington and Tehran, and each one collapsed following the same predictable triggers: disputes over enrichment levels, gaps in verification, and outside conflicts involving Israel or regional proxies that neither side could fully control. With that pattern in mind, the June 2026 MOU starts to look less like genuine progress and more like history repeating itself, only this time with a nuclear-capable Iran, a more exhausted region, and far higher stakes on the table. Which brings us to the part of this story most people are missing entirely: the hidden strategic calculations driving both sides to sign a deal neither one fully trusts. This is where everything changes, because the deal isn't protecting Iran from America. It's protecting America from itself. Start with the Strait of Hormuz. On paper, its reopening looks like an American demand imposed on a defeated Iran. But look at who actually depends on that waterway, and the picture inverts. Roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and around a fifth of global LNG shipments pass through that 33-kilometer channel every single day. Nearly 20 million barrels of oil move through it daily, representing close to $600 billion in annual energy trade. South Korea sources 60% of its crude through Hormuz. Japan relies on it for nearly 3/4 of its oil imports. India depends on it for roughly half its crude and 60% of its natural gas. Iran, by contrast, has far less riding on the strait's normal operation. Its own oil exports, overwhelmingly bound for a single customer, China, can be rerouted or delayed with manageable pain. Iran's leverage doesn't come from needing Hormuz open. It comes from being able to threaten closing it. Every disruption there sends Brent crude spiking above $90 a barrel, rattles fuel prices from Seoul to Stuttgart, and lands directly on American consumers, and by extension, American politics. That asymmetry is the first clue that Washington needs this clause resolved more urgently than Tehran does. Now consider the $300 billion reconstruction commitment buried inside the agreement. For years, American rhetoric toward Iran oscillated between sanctions and thinly veiled hints at regime change. A reconstruction fund of this size signals something different entirely: a bet that a stable, functioning Iranian government, even an adversarial one, is preferable to the alternative: a collapsed state, a power vacuum, and an unpredictable successor regime in a nation that still sits atop a nuclear program. That's not the posture of a superpower dictating terms to a defeated enemy. That's the posture of a government trying to manage risk it cannot fully control. And here is where the story turns darker. While negotiators shuttled between Geneva and Doha, satellite imagery obtained and analyzed in early July revealed reconstruction activity at Iran's underground Talaganu facility inside the Parchin military complex. In Samsanjo is excavation around bomb penetration holes, concrete reinforcement, and what appears to be preparation for a permanent structural cap. This wasn't happening in secret defiance of the agreement. It was happening during the very 60-day freeze period both sides had signed onto weeks earlier. If confirmed, it means Iran isn't simply waiting out the negotiating window. It's using that window as operational cover, turning what Washington framed as a concession period into strategic breathing room for reconstitution. This is the contrast that defines the entire deal. The public narrative says America dictated the terms, and Iran, weakened by strikes, had no choice but to accept them. The strategic reality says something closer to the opposite. Washington is managing an oil market risk it cannot fully contain, betting on a regime it once tried to remove, while the other side quietly rebuilds behind the cover of a diplomatic clock it never fully trusted. That distrust runs both directions, and it isn't hidden. Iranian officials involved in the talks have made clear their skepticism of American commitments, treating each provision as transactional leverage rather than a step toward genuine reconciliation. The Xueqin Center's own assessment from the final negotiating stretch noted that both Washington and Tehran were racing to frame any agreement as a personal victory, a posture that actively delayed finalizing basic terms even as officials insisted a deal was close. That's not the language of trust. That's the language of two governments buying time against each other. These hidden dynamics don't stay contained to Tehran and Washington. A deal this fragile, built on an oil choke point this important, and a nuclear freeze this porous, doesn't just determine the fate of two negotiating teams. It ripples outward into global markets, into the economies of American allies across Asia and Europe, and into the credibility of every future non-proliferation effort. That's the story we turn to next. But that isn't the most important development, because what happens next depends on decisions neither side has made public. Start with the oil market, because that's where the fragility of this deal becomes visible in real numbers. When the MOU was first signed in June, Brent crude fell below $72 a barrel, its lowest point since before the war began, as shipping traffic through Hormuz began climbing back toward normal levels. Analysts and motoring groups celebrated falling pump prices from London to Los Angeles. That relief lasted less than 3 weeks. When the United States revoked its sanctions, waiver on Iranian oil, and launched fresh strikes in early July, Brent crude surged back above $76, then approached $80 a barrel within days, wiping out nearly a month of market calm in a matter of hours. The IMF explicitly warned that renewed conflict could extend commodity price volatility, further threaten supply chains, raise prices, and weigh on financial conditions globally. This isn't a regional inconvenience. It's a mechanism that transmits Gulf instability directly into the price of gasoline in Ohio, diesel in Manchester, and LNG contracts in Tokyo. Now consider what happens to non-proliferation credibility if the satellite evidence of Iranian reconstruction at Parchin is confirmed. The entire architecture of the MOU rests on the idea that a 60-day freeze period means something, that Iran will hold its nuclear program in place while negotiators hammer out a final settlement. If Iran is quietly rebuilding hardened facilities during that exact window, it doesn't just undermine this specific deal. It tells every future adversary and every future negotiating partner that interim freezes are performative, not enforceable. That erosion of credibility outlasts this particular conflict. It changes how the next nuclear negotiation, wherever it happens, gets structured and trusted from the outset. Then there's the political trap closing around Trump specifically. He has spent months publicly declaring the deal was just days away or fully complete, only to watch it stall repeatedly. His own political base has criticized him for conceding too much, for the frozen asset release, for the reconstruction fund, for negotiating with Tehran at all, while simultaneously demanding he avoid dragging the country into a prolonged Middle Eastern war. That leaves him boxed in from both directions. If the deal collapses entirely and fighting resumes at scale, he owns a war he promised would be brief. If he pushes through a deal seen as too generous to Iran, he faces backlash from his own coalition for looking weak. Notably, Trump himself has denied specific terms reported in the deal, insisting publicly there is no $300 billion payment to Iran, even as reporting on the framework's contents continued to circulate, a sign of how politically toxic the appearance of concession has become. International reactions reflect this same uncertainty. Analysts covering the negotiations have been careful to separate the resumption of talks from any guarantee of actual peace, cautioning that diplomacy continuing is not the same as diplomacy succeeding. Regional mediators Qatar and Pakistan have stepped in repeatedly just to keep communication lines open between Washington and Tehran, suggesting neither government fully trusts the other to interpret the agreement's terms consistently. One geopolitical analysis put it bluntly: a signature is not a settlement. The MOU paused the fighting, but it hasn't resolved the contradictions that made the war possible in the first place. With the stakes this high, the next phase of talks will determine whether this becomes a lasting framework or another failed interim deal added to a decade-long list of collapsed Iran agreements. Each of these paths leads to a different balance of power in the Gulf, and the region may not get a fourth chance. The first scenario is the narrowest and arguably the most likely in the immediate term. Talks resume in Doha, but instead of tackling the full 14-point framework, negotiators focus on a technical limited agreement covering Hormuz shipping access alone, restoring insurance guarantees, tanker safe passage, and a verification mechanism for naval movement. Under this path, the nuclear track effectively stalls, pushed into a follow-on negotiation that neither side commits to a firm deadline for. This outcome would calm oil markets in the short term, since shipping security is the variable traders watch most closely, but it would leave the deal's hardest question, enrichment limits and verification of facilities like Parchin, unresolved indefinitely. It's a path that trades durable resolution for immediate market stability. The second scenario is the collapse path, and it's already been previewed once. President Trump has been explicit that continued Iranian non-compliance, including provocations in the Strait or violations of the nuclear freeze, would trigger renewed military action, a warning that materialized in early July when strikes resumed after just weeks of ceasefire. If this scenario replays at scale, it wouldn't simply return the region to where it stood in February 2026. It would do so with global oil markets already sensitized to instability, with satellite evidence of Iranian reconstruction activity fueling justification for preemptive strikes, and with far less diplomatic goodwill left on either side to fall back on. This is the highest risk, highest cost outcome, and the one most likely to draw in regional actors like Israel more directly and for longer. The third scenario sits between the other two. Negotiators formally or informally extend the 60-day window rather than letting it expire on schedule. This wouldn't be resolution. It would be a managed stalemate, an acknowledgement that neither side is ready to finalize terms, but that both prefer prolonged ambiguity to outright collapse. Historically, this is the pattern that has defined nearly every Iran negotiation since 2015. Interim deals extended repeatedly rather than concluded each extension, buying calm without buying trust. This path is politically convenient for Trump since it avoids both the appearance of capitulation and the cost of renewed war, but it leaves the underlying nuclear question exactly where it's always been: deferred, not solved. Layered across all three scenarios are two forces that could tip the outcome unpredictably. The first is risk. A single miscalculated incident in the Strait, a misidentified vessel, and accidental engagement could collapse even the most carefully negotiated technical agreement overnight, given how thin the margin for error has proven to be in recent months. Verification disputes over Iran's nuclear facilities carry similar danger, since any confirmed violation of the freeze would remove the political cover Trump needs to keep negotiating rather than striking. The second force is opportunity, and there's tentative evidence it's already working. Iranian officials privately acknowledged that firing on shipping in the Strait had been a mistake, a rare admission that opened the door to resuming negotiations after the early July flare-up. Regional mediators, Qatar chief among them, have shown they can pull both sides back from the brink when direct channels break down. That mediator-broker de-escalation is the clearest sign that even amid open hostility, both Washington and Tehran retain some interest in keeping the diplomatic track alive, rather than abandoning it entirely. Whichever path unfolds, it returns us to the question this documentary opened with. Go back to where this documentary began. President Trump stood before cameras and called the MOU fully complete, a deal framed from the very start as something America was generously extending to Iran. But everything examined since then tells a different story. The Strait of Hormuz clause matters more to Washington's own economy and its allies than it does to Tehran's regional standing. The $300 billion reconstruction commitment reveals a government betting on Iranian stability, not celebrating Iranian defeat. And the satellite evidence of activity at Parchin suggests Iran may be treating the negotiating window not as a concession, but as cover. This is the paradox that defines the entire agreement. America speaks the language of leverage while acting from a position of structural dependency, on Gulf oil stability, on regional calm, on an outcome it cannot simply impose by military force alone. That contradiction hasn't been resolved by the MOU, it's been temporarily managed by it. And that distinction matters more than anything else in this story. Every interim deal since 2015, the JCPOA, the 2025 Oman talks, this year's Geneva framework, has followed the same pattern. None of them resolved the underlying distrust between Washington and Tehran. Each one simply managed the immediate risk of open war long enough for both sides to regroup, rearm, or renegotiate from a slightly different position. The real measure of success for this deal won't be whether talks resume in Doha next month. It will be whether Washington can stabilize the Gulf without ever having to publicly admit how much it needs Tehran's cooperation to do so. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was this 60-day clock ever designed to produce lasting peace? Or was it always meant to buy both governments just enough time to prepare for whatever comes after it runs out for good?